Welcome everyone. I am Dr. Tarang Kapoor and I teach philosophy. The topic of today's discussion is deontological ethics with special reference to Immanuel Kant. In the previous lectures, we have discussed what is deontology along with certain central concepts from Kant's ethics like importance of goodwill, motive, right action, action which is done with goodwill among others. We have also discussed the understanding of maxim, difference between categorical and hypothetical imperatives, and the first formulation of categorical imperative, which with certain illustrations discussed in Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. In this lecture, we will study the second and the third formulation of categorical imperative. Let us now begin with discussing the concern Kant had in the first formulation of categorical imperative. The first formulation of categorical imperative is a test of whether we can rationally will that our maxim be a universal law. It is important to clarify that willing and wanting or liking are not the same thing. They are fundamentally different from each other. Someone can want something that they don't will, and someone can will something that they don't want. Kant here is concerned with willing, not wanting, as neither morality nor rationality depends on what we want or desire. Since disobeying the categorical imperative involves a self-contradiction, therefore it is not only morally wrong to disobey the imperative, it is also irrational or will lead into contradiction. Morality and rationality are categorical. The demands to be rational and moral apply to each one of us and do not stop applying to one only if one does not take care about them or one is not interested in them. Interest or desire simply does not hold value when it comes to categorical imperative. While the first form of the categorical imperative requires us to universalize the moral action, in the second form of imperative, we are asked to consider what constitutes proper treatment of persons as persons. Namely, why human beings are human beings. Now, Kant has a very simple answer to this. Human being is a rational being, and one of the key characters of being a person is their ability to be able to set their goals right. We have discussed the significance of freedom of will in our introductory lectures on ethics. The importance of freedom of will is brought forward by Kant when he argues that persons are autonomous beings. The word auto here means self and nomos means rule or law. Persons are self-ruled, or we may say that they are capable of being self-ruled. As persons, we have reasons to choose our own life plans. Our friends, our choices can be made by us and for us. We believe that although at times we are influenced in these choices and reasons by our situation, by other contingent factors, by other people, their role in our life, still we have to acknowledge the fact that these choices are ultimately our own choices. Thus, persons are different from things, and things cannot choose what they wish to do. Persons, on the other hand, can decide how they shall use other things. For instance, we use pen to write our thoughts, we use vegetables to cook a dish, we use fruits to nourish ourselves. So then it is appropriate in this scheme of things to use things, objects for our ends. But it is not appropriate to use persons as though they were things purely at our own disposal and without a will of their own. So persons, unlike things, cannot be used as things. This brings us to the second formulation of categorical imperative, that is the principle of humanity. Always treat humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Unquote. Here, the question is, what does it mean to be treated as an end in itself? So let us first look at two kinds of approaches. One is to be treating something as holding intrinsic value, and the other is treating something as having an instrumental value, or we can say something as a means to an end. Now, what is means to an end? When we use something or someone as a tool or an instrument to achieve some goal, we were talking about it a while back. It is then that we use something as holding instrumental value in the achievement of something which is having an intrinsic value. So it is someone, when that person is used as a means to an end, he or she is then treated as a tool for someone else's purposes in a very broad sense. For instance, if someone is kept as a slave, that person obviously is being treated as a means to an end. So is anyone who is being used for other person's purposes without regard for his or her intrinsic value and dignity as a human person. People are valuable in themselves regardless of whether they are useful or loved or valued by others or not. So the other contingent factors because of which we value someone are not the factors because of which we value them as human person. So therefore, we should not simply use others or allow ourselves to be used. Although I may in some sense use someone. Let us take an example. When I have to paint my house, Kant has taken it himself. I may not simply be using people when I am using them to paint my house. Kant says that the goal of getting my house painted should also be the goal of the painter, who is also a person and not just an object to be used for me to carry forward my own goals. The painter must know what is involved in this project. I cannot lie to her and manipulate her into doing something in which she otherwise might have no interest or no agreement of doing. And she must agree to paint the house voluntarily, that is, out of her own choice, rather than being coerced into doing it. This would violate the requirement not to use persons as an end. Historically speaking, for the 18th century, the second form of categorical imperative, in as far as it highlights the immortality of treating other humans as means to an end, is a tremendously important political and social statement. For this, we will have to understand the 18th century situation. Slavery was a social and political accepted phenomena. Slavery was a social factor, and abuse of lower classes by the upper classes was a commonplace feature. It was in this context that it was a revolutionary idea coming from Kant to state that it is not social status, it is not these contingent factors that determine one's standing in a moral universe, but only the capability to use reason should stand as the factor due to which a person holds intrinsic value. As one of the leading lights of the age of reason, Immanuel Kant stated that any rational human being deserves respect. Thus, people are value givers because they can decide rationally what they want and what they do not want. So the concept of agency is very clearly brought forward by Immanuel Kant here. Now, we will now look into the third formulation, the principle of kingdom of ends. Immanuel Kant discusses the principle of kingdom of ends in the same thrust as he was putting on human beings as an end in themselves in the principle of humanity, the second formulation. Similarly, here he is talking about a kingdom which will have an intrinsic value, a kingdom which has to be respected because it is an end in itself. Act in such a way as if you were always, through your maxims, a law-making member in a universal kingdom of ends, unquote. We ought always to ask whether some action we are contemplating could become a universal law of nature or not. This was brought forward in the first formulation of categorical imperative, right? Kant believed that nature as a system is organized according to certain laws. The effect of this version is actually to stress universality and rationality of morality. For nature necessarily operates according to certain coherent laws. We are all alike as persons, and together we form a community of persons. Remember, kingdom, a community of people coming together. Kant calls this community of rational people a kingdom of ends, that is, a kingdom in which all persons will be authors as well as subjects of the moral law. So, moral law will be authored by people and for people. They are themselves making it and they are going to be governed by it. In a way, it goes on to draw from what we have already learned in the second form of the categorical imperative, that is, respect for humanity or autonomy of the individual. However, the question here remains whether the action which we are contemplating would be fitting for and promote a community of people who will be respecting that action or that law which we are going to make. These formal actions of categorical imperative involve other interesting elements of Kant's philosophy. Let us now look into another formulation of the moral law suggested by Kant. When we apply the categorical imperative, it is something for all which all rational beings can do, and even if they can't do it exactly the way Kant uses it, the logic of it should be compelling for all people who can ask themselves the question, would I want everybody to do this? The law which I am wanting to work for me, is that law universalizable? Kant calls this moral autonomy. The only moral autonomy or authority that can tell us to do something and not to do something has to come from our own reason. It is our reason. This brings us to another version given by Kant, and I am now going to quote it from Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. The quote begins, "Act in such a way that your will can regard itself at the same time as making universal law through its maxims," unquote. So your will should be able to regard itself at the same time as making a universal law. This is the ultimate principle of autonomy present in the third formulation, or I should say alongside the third formulation in Groundworks of Metaphysics of Morals. An autonomous will would not be subjected to any interest. That is the idea behind this principle. It would only be subject to those laws it makes for its own self. Every rational being has a will, which makes universal law, and this makes the categorical nature of the categorical imperative explicit in front of us. Since the will makes universal law, it binds itself to this law without requiring mediation of any contingent end or interest. Since it is impossible for the universality of self-legislation to be based on any interest of the will, the practical principle and the imperative we are asked to obey thereby becomes unconditional. Since categorical imperative involves necessitation of the will, by self-legislation of the law. Therefore, Kant calls this principle of morality the principle of autonomy. The will itself self-legislates the law. In a sense, you may say that if we add the idea of people being ends in themselves to the idea of the categorical imperative, then the result will be the kingdom of ends. So people who are ends in themselves, when they are by self-legislation applying the categorical imperative, we arrive at kingdom of ends. And kingdom of ends is the end all of us have to aspire towards. So as we have previously seen, if all people follow the same principle and disregard their own personal inclinations, then all will end up following the same moral rules, because all will have universalized their intentions by then. In this kind of a world, with everyone doing the right thing and nobody abusing anyone else, a new realm will have been created, the kingdom of ends. Kingdom here, this is another way in which we can understand the concept. Kingdom poetically describes a community of people, and ends indicates that people treat one another as holding intrinsic value, that is an end in itself, and not holding any kind of instrumental value. These ends are beings which will have their own goals in life. They will never merely be treating other members as means towards their own ends, and therefore we may suggest that every time we show respect and consideration for one another, we make the kingdom of end a little more real. So we in our life we are actually progressing towards the kingdom of end if we are following this procedural morality. And this also brings us back to this understanding of deontology as a procedural ethics. Another way to approach this third formulation is to ask, what kinds of ideal world will virtuous people create under the guidance of this practical reason? The idea of kingdom of ends is what I hope for if I do what I ought to do. So like me, everybody else, if they hope for what they ought to do, we ought to act only by maxims that would harmonize with a possible kingdom of ends. We have perfect duty not to act by maxims that create incoherence or impossible state of natural affairs, by then leading into a contradiction. Rather, when we attempt to universalize them, we have imperfect duty not to act by these maxims that lead to any kind of unstable or, undesirable state of affairs. We are both subject to the moral law and are also author of the law because it flows from us, that is, from our very own nature as a rational being. A rational being belongs to a kingdom of end in his or her dual capabilities as head as well as a subject who is a member. Here, a rational being is subject to the law as a member of the kingdom of end, or whether a rational being is making law as its head, he must always regard himself as an autonomous lawmaker. Kant has argued that human understanding is the source of the general laws of nature that structure all our experiences, and that human reason gives itself the moral law, which is our basis for the belief in God, freedom, and immortality of the soul. So, from the third formulation of categorical imperative of autonomy of the self as well as kingdom of ends, we now come to a kingdom of ends. Remember, that is where Kant's categorical imperative is leading towards. So, in this sense, if our human reason gives us this moral law, what will be the basis of belief in these three postulates which Kant is now talking about, and I'm going to discuss them. The postulates of morality, they are called. They are implied by the moral law and the moral nature of man. The three postulates are freedom of will, immortality of soul, and belief in God. These postulates are required by the demands of our moral consciousness. Without believing in these postulates, our moral ideals and aspirations will be defeated. That is the belief of Kant. If we do not believe in either one of them, then the whole idea that we are wanting to progress towards a moral ideal, an absolute state of affairs, where we aspire to be the authors of the moral law, this whole purpose will meet a defeat. It is with these postulates that moral law has any meaning, and the possibility of attaining the goal of our moral striving is assured. The question is, can we hold ourselves responsible if we are not free to answer the call of duty? So let us look at the freedom of will. If we are ourselves not making a decision, can we hold ourselves responsible for that decision? And we have done this discussion in the introductory lectures on ethics on voluntary human agency in ethical decision making. So Kant here is evoking that freedom of will, without which one will not be able to carry forward the call of duty, because then we will not be able to ensure the responsibility or pin down the responsibility. Freedom is implied by the sense of duty in Kantian ethics. If I may say, I ought implies that I can. While the empirical world of nature seems to imply necessity, if we deny freedom, then morality would lose its significance. Freedom of will is an important postulate. Freedom is the self-determination of reason. When I will the good, I postulate my freedom, my immortality, and God's existence together. In a rational worldview, and happiness are in conflict. In a rational worldview, our virtue and happiness are in conflict. The goal of inclination is happiness. We want to be happy because we are inclined towards it. Our desires, our intentions want happiness, and the goal of goodwill, or the pure motive, as we have already discussed, is to achieve virtuous life. So there is always this kind of a conflict in our life between whether to choose happiness or to choose virtue. The highest good, which Kant talks about, goodwill, is actually striving towards a harmony of virtue and happiness. The supreme good for all mankind is virtue in the sense of worthiness to be happy. So we have to understand that happiness is not the aim of moral conduct, but it is a result of moral conduct. If the union of virtue and happiness is to be attained, then another life has to be taken as a condition. So, why is it important to postulate immortality of soul in Kant's system of kingdom of ends is very well explicated here by seeing our life in unison with the virtue and happiness. When I will the supreme good, I postulate my freedom, my immortality, and God's existence together. Belief in God is a necessary condition for the possibility of the highest good even to exist. To believe in God is a demand of reason and moral necessity in this kind of a system. Our progress towards the most perfect ideal life implies immortality and good. Only God can be the head of the kingdom of ends, as only God is without the needs and powers adequate to his will. In the groundworks, Kant also acknowledges that since we are not God, the kingdom of end is only a possibility for us. Its actuality is actually dependent on there being a God. So the result of all human beings acting rightly is kingdom of ends. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Learners, in this lecture we have discussed the second formulation of categorical imperative, that is the principle of humanity as an end in itself, and the third formulation, the principle of autonomy and principle of kingdom of ends, as mentioned by Kant in Groundworks of Metaphysics of Morals. We have also studied the three postulates of morality, namely freedom of will, immortality of soul, and existence of God. Thank you.